You want it to be obvious enough that a person who is willing knows that they're being propositioned. You don't want to be like George Costanza in Seinfeld, where his date invites him up for coffee. He says, no, the caffeine will keep me up. And then on the way out, he realizes coffee doesn't mean coffee. Coffee means sex. And the main idea is that laughter, it generates common knowledge. When you're laughing, you know it because it's interrupting your breathing. And everyone around you knows it because it's noisy. But laughter can also be used aggressively, as when the whole room starts to jeer and laugh at something stupid. When you make fun of the preacher, the teacher, the politician, the blowhard, late night TV, where most of the monologues now are jokes at the expense of Donald Trump. It's a way of taking someone down. There, it's taking someone down aggressively. That's why a shared sense of humor is one of the keys to romantic attraction and also the keys to friendship.
This isn't your average business podcast, and he's not your average host. This is the James Altucher Show.
Have you been very busy promoting the book?
Oh, yes. Yeah. 3 weeks of touring, continuing, plus a bunch of podcasts.
This is such a fascinating topic because it's almost a topic about common sense. Okay. With common sense, it's the same idea that everybody knows this is the thing you do in this situation. If you're riding on a bus and a bunch of seemingly violent people come onto the bus, it's common sense to get off the bus. That's my example.
Okay.
And everyone is thinking that on the bus. Another thing I was thinking was a potential title for this book. It's almost like communicating with less information. If a man winks at a woman or a woman winks at a man, it's not necessarily saying, hey, I want to date you or have sex with you, but it's like partial information towards that. And so this book is a lot about how people communicate with partial information because the remainder of the information is common sense.
Yes. Well, there's a chapter in the book called Weasel Words about why we don't blurt out our feelings in black and white. We hint, we wink, we shilly-shally, we use innuendo, euphemism. We want to come up for Netflix and chill. G officers, there's some way we could settle the ticket here without going to court and doing a lot of paperwork.
So a lot of it is about testing the situation. For instance, we all know what these things mean, but we don't know what each other's boundary is. And we're trying to find out what those boundaries are. Is the officer willing to take a bribe or is he not? And you don't want to directly say, hey, will you take a bribe? Because that might be an illegal statement or it might be too much. We might go over the boundary. So a lot of this partial information, when everyone knows that everyone knows, is about testing those boundaries.
Yes. When we don't know the values of the person that we're dealing with, it's what game theorists call a game of imperfect information. You just don't know what the other guy wants or likes. The case of a fraught proposition, like a veiled bribe, a veiled threat, a sexual come on, you want it to be obvious enough that a person who is willing knows that they're being propositioned. You don't want to be like George Costanza in Seinfeld, where his date invites him up at the end of a meal for coffee. He says, no, the caffeine will keep me up. And then on the way out, he realizes coffee doesn't mean coffee. Coffee means sex. So you don't want it to be so subtle that it goes over the head of someone like George Costanza. On the other hand, you don't want to be so obvious that if the person does reject the offer, it changes the nature of the relationship. In the obvious case of bribing a police officer, it's literally illegal to bribe a cop. And so you don't want the statement to be provable in a court beyond a reasonable doubt that you bribed the officer. In the case of an ordinary social circumstance, there's no law against, say, bribing a maitre d' to be seated immediately if you don't have a reservation in a restaurant. Or there's no law against inviting a proposition to someone for sex as long as they don't work for you. But still, what I emphasize in the book is that our social relationships are grounded in common knowledge. What does it mean for two people to be friends? Each one knows that the other one knows that the first one knows that the second one knows that they're friends. Likewise, lovers or coworkers or boss and a subordinate. And common knowledge, which is what direct blurted out speech generates, can challenge the nature of a relationship. And so if one person at a date says you want to have sex and the other one turns them down, they really can't go back to just being platonic friends or, a professor and a student or a boss and an employee. Whereas if it's stated subtly enough that it can't be shown to be common knowledge, then they can go back to the relationship. This is particularly relevant to cases where, unlike bribing the cop, where it's just against the law, or sexual harassment, but even in everyday life, when there's no cop who's going to frog march us off in handcuffs, we still care about the nature of our relationship. And that's the bottom line. Relationships are matters of common knowledge. What I know that you know that I know that you know. Blurted out speech generates common knowledge. Hints, innuendos can convey the message, but without the common knowledge. And so the relationship can survive.
Yeah. And it's also could be the case that this idea of conveying partial information or not blurting out the full honest truth, that the partial information is what everybody is fine with. Maybe the two colleagues who want to have sex with each other, they're fine knowing that each feels that way, but just not saying it. Because like you say, then it changes the nature of the relationship. Maybe there's other things going on in their life, so they can't explicitly say it, even though they both know it.
That's right. Our social relationships are matters of common knowledge. We don't sign a contract to become friends or lovers.
I
But
usually sign confidentiality agreements and things like that with friends.
and treat up, yes, right. I mean, the time may come for that, but it's not generally not how the relationship is formed.
Right.
When we don't want to change the nature of a relationship, there are some things we just don't say out loud if they challenge the common knowledge that props the relationship up. Conversely, sometimes to establish a relationship, you want to generate the common knowledge. So in the case of lovers, it's the ritual, I love you, and then the return, I love you. That's not ordinary language. You're not negotiating something, but just the ritual of each one saying it in turn means, that's it. From now on, we're lovers. Whereas if one person were to say it wasn't reciprocated, it's a situation also from Seinfeld that I analyze in the book. Jerry warns George, who's contemplating saying, I love you to a woman he's been dating for a while. He says, if you say I love you, you don't get that I love you return. That's a big matzo ball hanging out there. And that's a metaphor, a big matzo ball hanging out there. Anything that you describe as if it's visible, obvious, salient, conspicuous, self-evident, in your face, that's the way we talk about common knowledge. And getting back to common sense, the metaphors for conspicuous, salient object is the way we talk about common knowledge, because generally we don't use the language of game theory. We don't say, well, I know this, and you know this, and I know you know that I know that you know that I know that you know this. That's not the way we usually talk, but we do talk in terms of something that is out there.
So the whole idea is like in the emperor wears no clothes. Everybody knows this, but everybody watching knows that the emperor's wearing no clothes, but everybody also knows they shouldn't say anything or they might get killed. So they all kind of keep it to themselves. And this is where the game theory comes in. You have a goal, and sometimes even when everybody knows what your goal is and you know what everyone else's goal is, not acknowledging it is sometimes the best way to achieve either your goal or close to your goal. So for instance, in the Seinfeld example, they really are saying in sort of subtly, I know that she knows that I know that she knows. Because if George says I love you, they both know if she doesn't say I love you back, then that's a bad thing for the relationship. And so they are strategizing, offline. So let's say online is when George is actually talking to the woman and saying, I love you. So now they're strategizing offline, whether this is a good approach to achieve the goal. And the goal is George wants to have a relationship, perhaps have sex with this girl, whatever. And you use this idea that I know that she knows that I know that she knows. You use this idea when strategizing to achieve a goal. That's why that Seinfeld example is so good.
Yes, that's right. There are many levels of awareness of awareness of awareness. And that's what makes social life so interesting. That's why we have sitcoms and murder mysteries and spy thrillers. We exercise our ability to get inside each other's heads as others are getting inside our heads or inside the heads of a third party. It's a cognitive skill that makes social life possible. And we sometimes exercise it through fiction and plays and comedies.
Well, you have a chapter on laughter in here, and I think that's so interesting because so much of humor is about breaking the pattern. Everyone knows that, she knows that I know that she knows that I know. Breaking that pattern somewhere in the middle is funny. So if George says to the girl, I love you, and she says, we'll talk to you soon. And that, right, you just laughed because doing a pattern disrupt like that, breaking that social norm that is embedded into us for whether it's dozens of years or hundreds of thousands of years, breaking that norm is funny, or it's a failed negotiation.
Well, in social life, I mean, when you're watching a comedy, often you're watching it alone or one other person, so it's not part of your social life. I talk about why we laugh in the first place, just in ordinary social settings. And the main idea is that laughter generates common knowledge. When you're laughing, you know it because it's interrupting your breathing, and everyone around you knows it because it's noisy. And you know that they know that you know it, and so on. So you're creating common knowledge of something. What is it? Generally, in humor, there's someone whose dignity has been taken down a notch. That can be done aggressively when you make fun of a boss behind his back, or you take someone down, the neighborhood gas bag or pompous jerk. But it can also be used convivially when you use self-deprecating humor, you tease yourself, you josh your friends, and it's very enjoyable. Generally, it's not terribly funny out of context. You kind of had to be there. In fact, I cite a guy, a ethologist named Robert Provine, who actually went out and got records of what makes people laugh in ordinary social settings. That is, as opposed to comedy clubs and sitcoms and so on, which are very, special kind of laughter. Most of the time when we laugh, it's not because someone told a funny joke. It's because there's some everyday social interaction and someone says, oh, what is that supposed to mean? Or you can't be serious. Or you'll never believe what happened when I tried such and such. That's what laughter is like in real life. And I think what it's doing in convivial settings, not when you're taking someone down, but when you're reinforcing a friendship, is you're saying we're all equals. Even though one of us might be better looking or smarter or richer or more powerful than the other, that's not the way we relate with each other. We relate as equals. And so I'm going to make fun of myself. I'm going to gently make fun of you just to reestablish that that's what we're all about. We're all equals in a compact of mutual helping and enjoyment.
Right. So it's sort of like a negotiation. Like if you're in a group of people and you make a joke, let's say even a mildly self-deprecating joke, you're expressing this vulnerability, and vulnerability is often currency in a social situation. And everyone sort of knows that. That's a way to kind of, everybody becomes equals.
I would say it's currency, but it's more signaling. It's announcing your intent, your understanding of the relationship. Namely, that I'm not going to lord anything over you. I'm not going to pretend to be superior. I'm not going to flaunt what's so great about me. There might be other circumstances where I want to do that, but not in this circle. In this circle, we're all friends. And laughter helps to do that. But laughter can also be used aggressively, as when the whole room starts to jeer and laugh at something stupid someone said. When you make fun of the preacher, the teacher, the politician, the blowhard, late night TV, where most of the monologues now are jokes at the expense of Donald Trump. It's a way of taking someone down. There, it's taking someone down aggressively. When it's among friends, it's taking us down so that we all are at the same level. We're all equals. We're all friends.
But it's interesting you bring up the politics. I find that a lot of conversations now are, let's say it's two people talking and they're meeting for the first time. They don't really know a lot about each other. They know the social norms, but they don't know about each other. And I find that a lot of this innuendos and partial information is, for instance, there's a whole kind of subtext of you don't know if someone's for Trump or against Trump. So there's a lot of back and forth as people try to figure out who each other are until they can have a real conversation about politics. And so there are these times when not everyone knows that everyone knows. So they do various signals and coded language with each other until everyone knows where they stand with each other politically.
Yes, that's exactly right. That, of course, is one of the features of everyday social life, for which humor can help. If you laugh at the same things, you're making common knowledge what was previously an assumption that you shared. And if you may or may not have shared, a way of establishing whether you share it is when you make a common knowledge, do you both laugh? And that's one of the things that laughter does. That's why a shared sense of humor is one of the keys to romantic attraction and also the keys to friendship. Laughing at the same things establishes that your background assumptions have been shared all along.
And what is it like? And you mentioned Darwin in I'm pretty sure it was the chapter on laughter. What is it about laughter specifically that kind of lends itself to sexual selection?
I think that in terms of mating, it's what we were just saying, namely that because laughter is a signal that when it is reciprocated, when it spreads contagiously, and we know that laughter is contagious, it's a signal that background assumptions that you carry with you are the same as everyone else's, particularly the background assumptions about someone's lack of prestige, dignity, standing, dominance. Since a romantic relationship involves shared interests, you're in it together. What's good for me is good for her, and vice versa. Um, Laughing at the same things establishes that our understanding of the world overlaps a lot.
Do you think it is about shared interests, or do you think, like, looking back to evolution and biology, I know this has been an interest of yours for many books. Is it that laughter somehow signifies that, let's say it's the man making the woman laugh? Does that sort of signal maybe the man has enough intelligence to be the protector, to be the hunter, whatever? I'm just making this up. I'm not an evolutionary psychologist, but what's the connection there?
Yeah, anything that flaunts a talent, a virtue, an asset can be sexually attractive. Not necessarily for a man protecting the woman against kidnapping or predators, but it's also the quality of the person's genes. Your kids are going to be 50% from them and 50% from you. You want to make sure that the 50% that isn't you are the best genes possible. And so that's why each member of a couple values positive traits in the other, together with the fact that those positive traits can actually affect them as they're being exercised in everyday life, whether it's for protection or solving problems or life presents lots of conundrums. And if you have a partner who's good at solving them, that helps both of you, together, and protection when that is necessary. But it isn't just for protection. It's not something that it doesn't have to be that simple. But in general, anything positive, athletic ability, musical ability, intelligence, health is desirable in a mate.
So I guess health is something that's very plain and easy to see for the large part. And humor, I guess, is something that's plain and easy to see. I don't need to carry around a musical instrument everywhere. I just can make someone laugh.
Yes, and someone who's quick-witted. There is a certain intelligence underlying wit, as opposed to just slapstick or crude scatological or sexual humor. Although that can be clever too, depending on how it's wielded. But yeah, humor can be a sign of someone's intelligence. A lot of us prize witticism from someone like Oscar Wilde or Bertrand Russell, or even clever comedians. And we use that as an assay of other people's intelligence in shopping for partners, mates, spouses as well.
So I have started many companies. Some did well, some did not do as well. I've also run many companies. I've advised many companies, and I've been involved in all aspects of the hiring process, whether sometimes I would have to hire a CEO, but sometimes software developer, sometimes designer, sometimes head of sales or business development. I've been involved in basically every aspect of running a business, and hiring is maybe the most important thing you could do when you start a business. So I'm going to give you one piece of advice, and it's related to what I'm talking about here. I used to think I was frugal because I would try to find employees as cheaply as possible, someone young, just starting out, whatever. But what I've learned is you do so much better as a business finding the best person in your field. If you want a head of sales, find the best head of sales. If you want a software developer, hire the best software developer. It ultimately will save you money, but it'll also save you so much time, so much aggravation, so much anxiety. These are all things you need to preserve. It's really important to hire correctly. When you're running a business, your mind is on your business 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's the problem with being an entrepreneur is you never leave the work at the office. So when you're hiring, you need a partner that works just as hard as you do. I have found that a great hiring partner is LinkedIn Jobs. When you clock out, LinkedIn clocks in. LinkedIn makes it easy to post your job for free, share it with your network, get qualified candidates that you can manage all in one place. And I find this is such a great platform to find people for your job because millions of people are on LinkedIn, millions of qualified people. Here's how it works. You post your job, LinkedIn's new feature helps you write job descriptions and then quickly get your job in front of the right people. Post your job for free, or you pay to promote it. Promoted jobs get 3 times more qualified candidates. You get qualified candidates. At the end of the day, this is the most important thing to your business, is the quality of those candidates. Based on LinkedIn data, 72% of small and medium businesses using LinkedIn say that LinkedIn helps them find high quality candidates. That's good information. You share with your network. So when you're on LinkedIn, your whole business network knows you're hiring. So find out now why more than 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring today. Find your next great hire on LinkedIn. You can post your job for free at linkedin.com/Altucher. That's linkedin.com/Altucher to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So, the concept of thinking in this, I know you've used the word recursive. I'm trying to avoid that word. But the concept of, just because like most people don't think like that this is, because it could go on forever. Oh, he knows that she knows that he knows that she knows it. It could go on forever. So that's what people mean when they say this is recursive. But like a classic example, and maybe the most practical example in real life, is something like poker, where someone's bluffing and you think to yourself, are they bluffing, or do they think that I think that they're bluffing? Or do they think that I think that they're bluffing, so now they really are bluffing? And then it can get recursive, where it could go on forever, where you're trying to determine if the person's bluffing or not, but it depends on how much they're thinking about whether you're thinking about their bluffing. So that's when it can go on forever. And there's no real answer to how to solve that problem other than observation. Like, is that how this person plays poker? Or the same, even simpler, rock, paper, scissors. If I do rock 2 times in a row, you could think, is he just doing rock forever? Or now does he think, I think he's doing rock forever, so now he's going to do paper? Or, whatever.
Yeah, I do analyze those, particularly in the previous book called Rationality, where I have a chapter on game theory. And I talk about what are called outguessing standoffs. But I talk about them again in this book because, as you note, they do pop up, and they do involve, again, to use the fancy schmancy word, recursive mentalizing. That just means trying to get inside someone's head as they're trying to get inside someone's head, maybe yours, maybe someone else's. So that's recursive mentalizing, but it's just getting inside, reading the mind of a mind reader is the way I put it. And indeed, poker is an example. Rock, paper, scissors is another one. In sports, the penalty kicker wants to know whether the goalie is going to guard left or right, and the goalie wants to know whether the kicker is going to kick left or right. Each one of them is trying to get inside the head of the other one, getting inside their head. The solution in those cases is to be random. That is, if you have some predictability, as you noted, or if there's some tell, if you give away your intention by leaning, twitching, then you give your opponent an advantage. That's why we have the expression "a poker face." That is, you don't give away even in a micro expression the kind of hand you're holding, and you can't. And randomness is essential. So in poker, you can't bluff all the time, because then your opponent will call your bluff. You can't bluff none of the time, because then you won't be pressing your advantage. And so a skilled poker player bluffs, not like mentally flipping a coin. It can't be 50-50. It really does depend on the value of the hand that you have. But depending on the payoff of being wrong in each direction, you randomize. And that's the optimal strategy in an outguessing standoff.
And so, given that, let's say, given your book, given that you wrote this book, how can one take this information and maybe use it in a setting like poker or rock, paper, scissors? And the reason why I'm asking about those 2 games is games in general are a safe way to practice life's more difficult situations. So poker might be like a game-like simulation of real-life negotiation, for instance. So that's why these concepts are so important for very important things like 2 countries negotiating, nuclear weapons. So given what you write in this book, how can one use this knowledge and information to better themselves to deal with life situations?
Well, it's not directly a kind of how-to book or a lifestyle.
I understand.
Yeah. But I think every social interaction involves either creating or denying common knowledge. And just to be aware of how that goes on can give you more insight. I think probably can be parlayed into greater, we have the expression social skill, savoir-faire, not being too far along the spectrum, being savvy. So I like to think that the book gives you a way of thinking about what actually social skill is. A lot of it is either negotiations like the one we talked about in terms of a veiled bribe, a veiled sexual come on, veiled threat. That is, how subtle versus blatant do you make your propositions so that they don't go over the head of someone who really wants to accept them, but they don't offend or insult someone who doesn't want to go along with them. So, that kind of calibration. And it's a calibration, as we talked about before, not just in terms of concrete rewards and punishments like being handcuffed or going free without a ticket, but also in terms of one of the things that the book tries to explain is what are the non-tangible social outcomes? What is it? Why do we sometimes feel awkward? Why do we feel embarrassed? Why do we feel ashamed? Why do we feel guilty? Why do we feel outraged? Those are the rewards and punishments in everyday life that we're constantly negotiating when we calibrate our level of speech. Or it may not be just speech. It can also be, when do you laugh? When do you make eye contact? Also, in the final chapter of the book, which is called Radical Honesty, Rational Hypocrisy. So I take up the question, which all of us have to deal with, which is, when do we just kind of cut the crap and blurt out what we mean? Would it be good if we did that all the time? Should we dispense with the white lies and the genteel hypocrisy and the politeness and the beating around the bush and the shilly-shallying and just kind of let it all hang out? And the answer is obviously no, we should not. There's a reason for hypocrisy. And in cases where people have to be brutally honest all the time, life is hell. There are fictional scenarios in which that's worked out for the amusement of the viewers, like the movie Liar, Liar. There's the case of a hedge fund, Bridgewater Associates, where the visionary boss, Ray Dalio, announced that from now we're all going to be completely honest with each other. If you think your coworker is doing a lousy job, just tell them in so many words. If a boss is unhappy with an employee, he'll dress them down in public. It did not work out. People left the company. They had to change the policy. How come? Well, our relationships, as I mentioned, are our relationships of cooperation, of affection, of deference, of transactional exchanges, are all depend on common knowledge of certain fictions. Friends will do anything for each other. Couples are loyal to each other in thought and deed. Bosses have the interests of their employees and of the organization at heart. Now, these are fictions. They're not true all the time, but if you challenge them too easily, then the basis of the relationship dissolves and you're no longer friends. You no longer have a stable chain of command. And so one always has to calibrate, when are the benefits of preserving the relationship worth the costs of the hypocrisy of not saying what's on my mind?
Yeah. So again, a lot of it is about negotiating a boundary. So for instance, let's say the boss in general has the employees' emotions and success at heart. And that could be true part of the time. It's not going to be true all the time because the company is going to have some agenda that the employee might not like. But in general, the basic fiction that creates the relationship should be there maybe 80-90% of the time. And then it's a matter of just figuring out where those boundaries are so you don't overstep. So you don't ask for a salary increase in the middle of a meeting where you're asked to take on more responsibilities.
You don't tell the boss that he's an idiot.
Right.
He's not even if he is an idiot, you're best off not saying that out loud.
Because poker, you have a goal. Like in poker, your goal is to win the hand, to make money, or to get out of the hand so as to avoid losing money. And so you need to negotiate the boundary of what a bluff is and how much this person is willing to bluff. And, deviating from that norm, from these social norms, like not calling your boss an idiot, if you deviate, it's got to have a purpose as well. Either you're making a joke or you want to get fired or you're creating content for a book or whatever.
Yes. So another way of putting it is that communication often works at two levels. One of them is the actual content. The other is the relationship you have with the person. And since you have to keep both in mind, a lot of verbal communication, even a lot of nonverbal communication, consists of what to do when those are intention. A simple example is just a polite request, like if you could pass the guacamole, that would be awesome. That's kind of a weird thing to muse about these hypothetical world in which you would be past the guacamole, and awesome is a little bit of an exaggeration. Nonetheless, it's better than just barking a command at a stranger or a friend. Give me the guacamole. Well, then you're kind of treating them like a servant or an underling, and you don't want to do that. So you calibrate the politeness so that what you want can be figured out, but you're not ruining the relationship by seeming to treat them like an employee or a servant. Likewise, with a lot of the requests that we have to make in life. Now, sometimes, as any couples therapist would say, their couples can have a long history of preserving the peace in the home by one person deferring to the other. Some things are not worth fighting about. I'll just let her have her way. That's more important. It's more important that we be at peace than I get my way in this circumstance. But if there's a long history where one member of the relationship is always getting their way and the other one is always getting the short end of the stick, that the subordinate always defers because they expect that the other partner will stand their ground, and they stand their ground because they can count on their partner always giving way. That can become pathological. It can lead to resentment, and the time may come where you risk the conflict, the unpleasant feelings. You challenge the nature of the relationship if the terms have gotten too unfavorable.
It's interesting because you say this is not a self-help book, and obviously it isn't. I just want to repeat, there's so many interesting stories and examples, pieces of knowledge and history that you draw upon when writing this book. It's just a fascinating book to read. But I always wonder with these books on the danger of being too academic. I always try to extract something where I could use in my life. And in this case, whether it's intended or not, what this tells me is having a catalog in my head of what the norms are in society. What are the different types of communication of partial information and how to understand those? Having more of a sense of that than the people I'm talking to gives me somewhat of an advantage in life. For instance, if I'm an employee asking for a salary from the boss, I might want to know what types of communication can elicit information from him that I could then make use of to later ask for a salary increase.
Yes. So I like to think that people who read my book will just see social life, every aspect of social life in a different light. Hope that there's just more insight as to what's going on with all the rituals and the role playing and the games people play. There's a logic to them. They're not just arbitrary rituals. You're not just like an actor assigned a role and you just read the lines. There's constant thinking, negotiation. As we've discussed, there are outguessing standoffs where you want to be a little bit unpredictable, or you don't want to have a tell that reveals your values. There are cases of calibrating the level of bluntness versus indirectness. There are cases of being aware what nonverbal signals like eye contact and blushing and tears can do. So I like to think that you'll never see social life the same way again once you understand the hidden logic behind them. And there is a hidden logic. It's not arbitrary. It's not irrational. I mean, it's irrational if you just write down what's happening. But I think if you understand how our relationships depend on common knowledge, often unstated, that our communication either reinforces or challenges the common knowledge that establishes a relationship, then you're not just a spectator. You've got to kind of play a color commentary on social life in the back of your mind.
Yeah, and then there's also a certain flexibility in all of this. So if any one of these sort of social norms, or when everyone knows that everyone knows, is too fixed in society, then it almost becomes useless. Because like you mentioned about poker, if I know you always bluff, then I'm going to wait to have a good hand and you're going to bluff and then I'll win the game. So there's always this unpredictability is a valuable skill also, knowing when to be unpredictable. And we see it playing out right now as we're recording this in the stock market today or yesterday. Friday, Donald Trump said, oh, I'm going to put 100% tariff on Chinese goods. And the stock market crashed. And the whole analysis over the weekend was, oh, here's the Donald Trump playbook. He announces some extreme, tariff, and then he sees what happens, and then he backs off slightly, the market always falls, and then it goes up. So that's like the playbook. But if he always did that, if any negotiator was totally predictable, then he's useless as a negotiator. So then there's always the fact that, well, Donald Trump's also unpredictable. So is this one of those times when he means it, or is he being unpredictable? Or, so there's a lot of analysis of these types of communications, and it plays out. And then the stock market is an example of the world judging, basically voting what it thinks. Is he being predictable or unpredictable? And then the market will go up or down accordingly. So this sort of stuff plays out in everyday real life, and having kind of an understanding of how these rules work is very interesting.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the stock market is a good example because it's aside from the actual productive value of stocks, namely, you own a share of the factory, and when the factory sells widgets at a profit, you get that percentage of the profit. I mean, that's technically what shares are or stocks are. But of course, that's not the only reason people invest. They also hope that they can sell it at a profit in the future because they hope that other people might want to buy it and sell it to still other people in the future.
Right.
Greater fools, as they sometimes call them. And so that's what speculation is, or commodities like cryptocurrency or real estate. And as you note, in a market, because prices are common knowledge and prices reflect instantaneous supply and demand, it's a game that you can't win on average. Some people win some of the time, but to the extent that the market is efficient, if you think you've got a hot tip on a company that's going to make an insanely great new gadget or some commodity that you predict everyone's going to want more of tomorrow, probably everyone knows that as well. And so the price has already been bid up. If you buy it at that price, you're not going to be rationally be able to sell it at a profit in the future. Sometimes you can, but just as often, the bubble will pop when the market starts running out of greater fools. That's why the standard advice for ordinary investors is buy an index fund, just a basket of securities. Don't think you're smarter than the market. Just be content to share in the overall appreciation of the market as productivity improves.
Right. So again, I'm curious, like when you were, like, I think of some of your books, The Better Angels of Our Nature. That one had such a beautiful and concise impact on me, actually. Just this idea that's just so stunning that actually violence has decreased over the past every century, over the past several thousand years. And exactly at a point where you sort of feel looking at the newspaper that violence has increased. Like, it's a very contradictory kind of conclusion in the book, but it's beautiful and optimistic how you explain it. And I understand this is a message that I've then repeated to many other people and quoted your book and so on. And so with this one, I'm curious, what made you sit down and write this, where I would say the conclusion from this is basically to become more aware as much as possible of all the hidden signals that exist in this universe of when everyone knows that everyone knows.
Yeah, that would be the main practical goal. It's also, I like to think of it as a kind of mind candy. There's some ideas in there that are kind of mind-boggling when you're exposed to them. One of the privileges that I have as being an academic, a professor, a scientist, is that I just get to learn about these ideas that are sometimes buried in the academic literature. If you read them in the academic literature, you can't understand a word they're saying because it's so, the prose is so soggy and it's academese. And I often get a sense from the people in the field, like, this is really hot stuff. This is really a fascinating idea, but it's buried in academia. And my niche is I try to explain them in a way that any curious person can understand. Because often the ideas they're not impossible to understand. It just takes someone to try to do the work of explaining them clearly. So that's what I try to do. And there are ideas, the idea of common knowledge itself, how it underlies coordination, how it's not just common sense. There are lots of surprising implications of common knowledge, how there are bits of game theory, which that all of a sudden makes it sound like some kind of mathematical, academic, obscure subject that's impossible to understand. But a lot of it is just explaining the hidden logic of everyday life. And you suddenly, I hope readers will just have all these aha moments, like, so that's why it works the way it does. That's why their Super Bowl ads are so often commented on. That's why people hoard toilet paper in an emergency. That's why The US doesn't officially recognize Taiwan, even though it's a sovereign state. That's why we blush, even if we haven't done anything wrong, just because other people think we've done something wrong. I think there are all these mysteries where there really is a clear logic behind it. And I at least do my best to make that comprehensible to my readers.
Can you explain your idea on why people hoard toilet paper? In today's world, you have to be super careful with your data, whether it's your passwords, your bank info, your private emails or messages. There is non-stop attempts to get your data. And some of it's like legit corporations stealing your data, and some of it's from hacking, and some of it's from viruses you have on your computer. By the way, everybody probably has some sort of virus on their computer. But here's the thing. You wouldn't take out your wallet in a shady part of town and start flashing your money around, right? Because you're worried that it would get stolen. Well, that's what you do every time you use public Wi-Fi. Public Wi-Fi is the shady part of town. And every time you use public Wi-Fi, you're exposing your data, unless you use ExpressVPN. Every time you connect to an unencrypted network, like let's say you use the public Wi-Fi in the airport, your online data is not secure. Any hacker on the same network, it's not easy, but they can do it. They can gain access to and steal your personal data. Again, passwords, bank logins, credit card details, on and on. It doesn't take much technical knowledge to hack someone. Your data is valuable. ExpressVPN stops hackers from stealing your data by creating a secure encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet. It's rated #1 by top tech reviewers like CNET and The Verge. So for me, it's personally important to use ExpressVPN. I don't know how my data is going to be used. I don't want people to even know where I'm at. I don't want people, obviously, to know my passwords. I probably use the same password for everything, so use that info how you must. But look, secure your online data today by visiting expressvpn.com/Altucher. And the Altucher is all in caps, ALTUCHER. That's ExpressVPN, EXPRESSVPN. expressvpn.com/Altucher to find out how you can get up to 4 extra months. expressvpn.com/Altucher. This is what I've been waiting for. Look, I've done 1,500 podcasts, a ton of podcasts about health and particularly anti-aging. I've had on every anti-aging expert on the planet. And finally, gummy bears to help me with anti-aging. These are the first ever longevity gummies powered by MitoPure, a delicious, easy way to put more energy into your day and to treat yourself. The only clinically proven urolithin A gummy for strength and healthy aging from the inside out. And I've taken it as supplements, but I'm not really a supplement taker kind of person. I'd much rather just like take a bunch of gummy bears and like eat it like candy. You can't really tell how much it's working, and sometimes you don't know for sure. Is it just, are you thinking this? But it does improve energy. Tests showed increases muscle strength by up to 12% after 16 weeks. These gummy bears deliver 6x more urolithin A than a glass of pomegranate juice, which, by the way, I was taking a ton of pomegranates as well. So this is the #1 doctor recommended urolithin A supplement. It's vegan, gluten-free, non-GMO, Clean Label Project certified, NSF content certified, and free of major allergens and artificial ingredients. MitoPure is the only clinically proven form of urolithin A. So if you want to stay strong and energized now and as you age, then you have to try MitoPure gummies. My friends at Timeline are offering 20% off just for my listeners. So head to timeline.com/Altucher to get started. That's timeline.com/Altucher. Your cells will thank you.
Oh, yes. It's kind of like a bank run or speculative investing in crypto. That is, it's a matter of common expectation. You expect that other people will expect something. So in the case of toilet paper, turns out, there really wasn't a shortage of toilet paper during the COVID pandemic, at least not at first. People stayed at home, so they were buying more consumer toilet paper instead of the big jumbo rolls of the office school. But the toilet paper companies quickly stepped up production to meet the demand. But what happened was people thought that there might be a shortage. So they ran out and they bought toilet paper, and other people thought that other people were doing that. So they ran out and bought toilet paper. And it became self-fulfilling. There really soon became a shortage because everyone was afraid of a shortage, which didn't exist beforehand. Uh, and that's what happens during a bank run. People will withdraw their savings from a bank, not necessarily because they think the bank is unsound, but they've heard a rumor that other people are withdrawing their savings because they think that still other people are withdrawing their savings. As Roosevelt said, when that actually led to a Great Depression, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And that was literally true. Often in these cases, there is one public event that gets that ball rolling. In the case of a bank run, it could be just a rumor that the bank is in trouble. Even if the bank isn't in trouble, that could put the bank in trouble as it triggers a bank run. In the case of toilet paper, some popular historians trace it back to a monologue by Johnny Carson in 1973. At a time, Johnny Carson had the talk show, The Tonight Show, which I think now is at Jimmy Fallon.
Yeah.
At the time, there were only 3 networks, and Carson was by far the most popular. So when you were watching Johnny Carson, he generated common knowledge because you knew that a lot of other people in the country were watching him, and they knew that still other people were watching it. So anything he said, you could kind of assume was common knowledge. One night he just made a joke about, it was in the middle of the oil crisis, and he said, oh, there's shortages of everything these days. There's shortages of oil, there's shortages of meat. Have you heard the latest? I read it in the papers. There's a shortage of toilet paper. Kind of got a laugh. It turned out it wasn't true at the time, but it actually became true after he made that joke, as everyone ran out to get toilet paper because they thought everyone else was running out. And ever since then, there's been a public legend, a rumor that toilet paper becomes scarce in an emergency. If it's a hurricane, if it's a blizzard. And so that just lodged it in popular consciousness. And the thing about common knowledge is, if something is common knowledge, that makes it a reality. That's all. It becomes a reality if everyone believes that it's a reality.
Right. So almost the rational thing to do is to go out and buy toilet paper because you know everyone's going to be scared about a toilet paper shortage.
Well, that's the problem. And that's why stores would then post a sign that says limit 3 packages per customer, not just because then no one could buy more than 3 packages, but because the sign was public, everyone knew that other shoppers saw the sign and they didn't have to worry about other shoppers stripping the shelves bare, which is why Roosevelt, in the midst of the Great Depression, declared a bank holiday. All the banks were shut for a period of time so that it didn't just prevent people from withdrawing their savings, but they knew that other people couldn't withdraw their savings. Now what we have is federal deposit insurance, where there's a big gold seal at the entrance of every bank or on the window. It says that deposits are insured up to some cap. And so you don't have to worry about the bank running out of ability to redeem its deposits because the federal government will bail it out. And so people don't withdraw their money. And that's why federal deposit insurance is almost never needed.
But, it's interesting when a store says only, limit of 3 packages of toilet paper per customer, that actually makes me get more worried that there's going to be a panic, right? So
if you didn't know, yes, true. If you didn't know beforehand. So the point of posting those notices would be if it's become kind of common belief that there's a shortage. But yes, you're right. If there isn't that belief to begin with, that could generate the belief.
Because what the store is basically signaling is that, look, we're having a problem right now.
Yeah.
So that's where we're doing this limit. So then the rational response is to get everyone in your family to come to the store, and then each person buys 3 things. So it gets into that when everyone knows recursion.
Yes, and that goes back to kind of the central, I don't want to call it a conundrum or a paradox of the book, but you said, well, what are the lessons for everyday life? There isn't like kind of a guideline that you could write down on a piece of paper and keep in your wallet, exactly because other people are always kind of outguessing you and you're outguessing them. And so any bit of any advice that you consistently follow will be kind of self-negating because other people will factor that in. So that's why I kind of resisted giving someone a lesson. Well, this is the way, this is the takeaway, because there can't be one takeaway because then other people will know that you're following that takeaway. So it's more like know the rules of the game that you're in.
One funny example you bring up that made me think was the Netflix policy. You mentioned there was a Netflix policy at one point that no employee is allowed to make eye contact with another employee for more than 5 seconds because that might constitute sexual harassment. And that's like a weird one where you're trying to legislate this social norm, essentially, which can't be legislated. I mean, there's so many things wrong with making a policy like that. It seems that, for instance, what happens then if somebody stares for 4 seconds? Is that not sexual harassment, or in 6 seconds they should get fired? So I didn't even believe that was really a true thing, but I'm just assuming it is since you wrote it in the book. But do they still have that policy?
This I don't know.
Uh-huh.
Well, it's a case where another example is when I think it was Antioch College gave their students a set of mandatory questions that they had to ask when escalating sexual intimacy. You have to actually say, can I unbutton your shirt? Can I loosen your belt? Can I, put my hand on this body part? Which it was kind of to make sure there couldn't be misunderstandings that could then later be used as charges of sexual assault or rape. The reason that it strikes a lot of people as violating common sense is that intimate relationships are not the kind of thing that we usually negotiate in so many words, because our communal relationships, friendship, family, romance, sexuality, are things that we have to kind of feel in our bones, that they're a fusion of interests and values that if you have to say them out loud, then you're kind of not getting what a romance is or what a friendship is or what family consists of. It's got to be something you just feel. And if you have to say it, that means you don't get it. As with any kind of informal relationship, there is the possibility of exploitation. In a couple, one could do all the taking and the other all the giving. In a sexual encounter, it can cross the line into assault. So sometimes there's a reason why you might want to or have to make it explicit. But when you do, it really goes against the deep-seated basis of that kind of relationship. You just don't negotiate things like a friendship or a romance. Again, that can lead to its own problems, which is why we have prenuptial agreements, why we have Netflix policies, Antioch College policies. There always is tension. There's always a feeling that those things are ham-fisted, heavy-handed, kind of go against human nature.
I think this is part of the point of the book, really, is to look at these extremes, because a lot of these cases, they're interesting because they're extremes at either end of what you're discussing, and to look at these extremes and understand why they are extremes. And this helps to, again, further understand what these social norms are, why they exist, why something is an extreme. I think that does have practical use in life to understand what you just said, that, look, intimacy is not something that could be legislated. It's something that we've been doing for billions of years or millions of years, and it is what it is. But then you have to kind of know your boundaries. And all of this stuff is important for real living.
Yeah, because it's a case where there can't be a hard and fast rule. So in the case of, say, a relationship that's starting to get exploitative, it may come a time when the deference that the weaker party extends to the stronger party, it staves off constant fighting and bickering, and that's a good thing. But sometimes, it gets to an extreme and you really have to bring it out into the open, whether with a couples counselor or one of them just screws up the courage and says, we need to talk. In the case where the unstated rules, the unstated kind of logic of intimacy can then be exploited so that, unless the one party screams no, they might be submitting to unwanted sexual advance. And that could be very serious. So it's sometimes there are things that are uncomfortable that have to be said, and there's no hard and fast rule as to where that line is. But knowing that there is such a line, that there are trade-offs. Life is about trade-offs, which is why I often resist giving across the board advice. It's more, be aware of what the trade-offs are. More of this means less of that. And there's no rule that says you have to have all of this and none of that. But, be aware of what you're trading off and realize when you're trading off too much of one thing for another thing.
Now, let me ask you, like, in academia, it's often an unstated rule that academics should be as academic and scientific as possible and not write consumer, academic psychology books or books oriented towards the consumer. And obviously you've made a career of writing very popular, very great, best-selling consumer books based on your knowledge in academia. Have any of your colleagues ever pushed back on you for doing this?
Definitely not explicitly. I mean, they might, get their digs in when they review one of my manuscripts or write a book review. There might be some resentment, but no department chair, no dean, no president. They've been completely supportive over a span now of more than 35 years, starting at MIT and now at Harvard. There used to be something called the Sagan curse, that Carl Sagan, brilliant astronomer, and in his time, probably the most famous scientist in the world. He had a TV series called Cosmos, watched enough that Johnny Carson, the talk show host, could regularly do an impression of Sagan that everyone would recognize. And there are even expressions like billions and billions of galaxies that Carson would make fun of Sagan for saying. And, people would laugh because they all saw it. And Sagan, he wrote a column in Parade magazine, which was the color insert to Sunday papers. He appeared as a guest on the Johnny Carson show constantly. So he was a popularizer and, for good stuff, for scientific literacy, for evolution, for international cooperation, for climate change. He was one of the first for the threat of nuclear winter. So he was a really good guy. And he was blackballed from the National Academy of Sciences, the prestigious national organization that sciences are elected to. And it was almost certainly because of jealousy and resentment. And, people warned me when I wrote my first popular book, The Language Instinct, after having been exclusively a good academic and written highly technical books that weren't sold in stores. They said, "Oh, look what happened to Carl Sagan." I think that has lessened. Not to boast, but I actually have been elected to the National Academy of Sciences, and I'm nowhere near as important to scientists as Sagan was in his day. So I think that taboo has weakened. I think I probably suffer it in less obvious ways. Who knows what happens when a manuscript is rejected or someone writes a nasty review? Are they motivated by jealousy? I'll never know.
How come it's one of the hardest things to recognize you're jealous as opposed to recognizing like, oh, you're in love or you're, other emotions. Maybe because it's something shameful. So you don't want to admit something shameful about yourself. But why do you think jealousy is such a hard thing to recognize in yourself?
I don't know if it's that hard. I mean, I think, I kind of know when I'm jealous and, it's a very unpleasant feeling. Sometimes it's necessary to safeguard a romantic relationship it's not okay for your partner to sleep with someone else or even to divert attention and affection from you and lavish it on someone else. Signaling that isn't a bad thing, but of course, jealousy can become pathological. And there are spouses who control every movement, every communication of their partner, making them prisoners. As with everything in life, there's kind of an optimal amount, and it's good to be aware of it, including in yourself. Like as you say, sometimes you're not aware maybe that you're motivated by jealousy. I think most often people are, but still you have to know when to control it, when to express it. If your partner laughs at someone else's joke, are you suddenly jealous? Because, maybe they'll end up sleeping together. And so I'm going to make sure that she or he is never in a social situation like that again. I mean, that can be suffocating. Again, it's a matter of calibration.
Yeah, but it seems like when you inflict, negative consequences on someone else because of that jealousy, but you rationalize it by saying, oh, this academic paper, for instance, is no good, so we're going to reject it. I feel like in those cases, if they recognize they're jealous, they'll say, oh, this academic paper is good, and so I shouldn't just let my jealousy reject it. I think those are more subtle examples of jealousy.
No, that's a great example, and it is an important point. It gets to the whole phenomenon of self-deception, that you've got a motive that you don't want to confess to because you can't defend it. So you hide it maybe even from yourself. So first of all, so they know you don't give off any tells. Other people can't tell that you're acting out of an inappropriate motive, but you don't inhibit yourself either. And you're right that from the point of view of, if I really am jealous of someone who's getting, all the fame, all the attention, all the money, I have their anonymous manuscript to review. If I don't acknowledge, I'm jealous of that bastard, I might think, this paper's a piece of junk, and not realize that judgment is actually being contaminated by my jealous feelings. So you're absolutely right. Being aware of your own emotions so that you can discount them when they contradict your values is just an important skill in being a mature, competent, effective adult.
But a lot of people seem to not realize that is an important skill. Like, and how do you practice that skill?
No, it's true. And that's a lot of what goes into wisdom is, what we call wisdom is acknowledging your own self-deception, trying to overcome it, trying to realize things about yourself and other people that were previously hidden from you that you may not be able to avoid altogether, but you can reflect on, you can take into account, you can compensate for. I think that's what goes into social skill when we deal with each other, and it's what goes into wisdom when we deal with ourselves.
Well, Steven Pinker, once again, such a great pleasure to have you on the podcast. This was such a fascinating book, When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, and the subtitles Common Knowledge and the Mysteries of Money, Power, and Everyday Life. Who doesn't want to know the mysteries of money, power, and everyday life? If you're interested in the mysteries of money, power, and everyday life, you absolutely have to buy this book. What a great book. So thank you once again, Steven Pinker. And of course, you've written many great books, Enlightenment Now, Rationality, The Better Angels of Our Nature, on and on and on. These books are like 6,000 pages long, each one. So you must spend all your time writing. Not this one, no. And I'm exaggerating. But they're all great. I meant it in a very positive way. Each page is filled with so much knowledge. I really appreciate it. It's a fountain of knowledge for me. And once again, being able to ask you these questions and have you answer them in person is great for me. So, and hopefully for the listeners. So thanks once again, Steven Pinker.
It's been a pleasure, James. Thanks for having me on.